Welcome to the 6th episode of the Doon School Podcast. The story of the Doon School started with the story of one man's dream which manifested into an institution which continues to be the leading light in the field of school education. When the term started in September 1939, Mr. Muin was still on the high seas on a Lloyd Trestino ship which had decided to give India a miss. Mr. Ashraf had gone to England to the School of Oriental Studies, but he soon found himself in the BBC. Mr. Kapoor had gone to do war work in the censor office. He was replaced by Mr. Nazim Ali, who found enough leisure to devise PT tables which became the basis of the PT leaders classes that were started the following year. Miss Flintoff was dame in Hyderabad House, Miss King having moved to Tata. The Open Air Theatre, or the Rose Bowl as it was christened, was inaugurated in October with a musical entertainment. Founders' Day had to be postponed because of an epidemic of diphtheria. Mrs. S.R. Das visited the school in November. Eric Shipton and Peter Mott, who had heard of the outbreak of war in the Karakorums, hurried back to offer themselves for war service, but the authorities were slow to use them, and so they returned to the school. During the winter holidays, Jack Gibson and John Martin took a group of 13 boys to Gulmarg. Unfortunately, Gulmarg in winter had never been so short of snow. The best thing about the expedition was that they met Arel Holdsworth, or Holdy as he was popularly known. Holdy had been a master at Harrow at the same time as John Martin. In 1931, along with other stalwarts like Eric Shipton and Frank Smythe, he was a member of the first expedition to Kamath, which is the second highest mountain in the Garhwal region of the Himalayas. Holdsworth, Shipton and Smythe are credited with the discovery of the Valley of Flowers, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, during their return from Kamath. Holdy had just resigned from the principalship of Islamia College, Peshawar, over a difference of opinion with the Board of Governors. He was 41 years old and had fought in the trenches in the First World War. He said he was fed up with education and was going to join the war effort. Martin and Gibson told him that it was unlikely he would be called up at this age and persuaded him to consider coming to the Doon School, which was in urgent need of a housemaster. And so it was that in the first term of 1940, Holdy arrived at Doon to take over Tata House. He came in his red station wagon, accompanied by his driver and 2 dogs, an Afghan and a golden retriever named Rosalind. As history was to prove, Islamia's loss was Doon's immense gain. Holdy was a legend and the 4th pillar of the foundation of our school's ethos. Foote, Martin and Gibson being the other 3. When term started in 1940, Kidd, Khanna and Hunter Boyd had left, and Arel Mehta had been lent to Rajkumar College, Rajkot. In exchange for Mehta, A.V. Caleb, a great hockey player, came to Doon. The other new masters were Chetan Anand, Y.R. Puri and R.L. Moore. Moore became the estate bursar and senior science master. He was to display great ingenuity in inventing new machines to use in the laboratory and elsewhere. In March 1940, the postponed Founders' Day was held in the courtyard of Jaipur House, with Sir V.T. Krishnamacharya presiding. The only entertainments provided were a cricket match with the IMA and a science exhibition. On March 25th, Mr. Chetan Anand made his debut with a Hindustani play called The Village. Captain Sardar Khan and Mrs. Franklin said goodbye to the school at the end of this term. The end of term coincided with the fall of France, but bad though the news was, there seemed no point in sitting in Dehradun. So the trio of Martin, Gibson and Holdy set off in Holdy's station wagon and Martin's prefect for Swat. There they climbed Munkial, a first ascent. Afterwards, Gibson went to Chitral and Holdy gave Martin his first lessons in trout fishing in Kagan and Kashmir. Newcomers in September were Mr. Bilgrami instead of Nazim Ali, Khwaja Sahib as secretary to the headmaster, and Mrs. Hardacre in the hospital. It was not a very eventful term. The staff gave a performance of The Monkey's Paw under the direction of Mr. Thomas, and the Geography magazine was published. The school orchestra played for the first time in assembly, thus ending a long controversy as to whether the singing should or should not be accompanied by the piano. It was also in this, the autumn term of 1940, that the first general meeting of the Old Boys Society was held, and the world-renowned Indian dancer Uday Shankar visited the school. Receiving dignitaries, leaders and artists of great repute and having them interact with the students has been a part of the school ethos since its inception and has played an important role in creating the pioneering spirit which is the hallmark of DOSCOs. In the holidays, Gibson and Holdy again took a party of boys to Gulmarg, while Mr. Martin visited Ellora and Ajanta in his prefect, for petrol was still unrationed. When the school reopened in 1941, Mr. Roy had left for England in charge of a party of Bevan boys or industrial trainees. Mr. Shom took his place. Founders' Day took place in March, with Sir Ramaswamy Mudaliar presiding. It was the first time the open-air theatre was used since the inauguration, and the pageant called the Unity of India was presented. For months afterwards, boys could be heard singing the songs which formed such an attractive part of this production. Nobody knew then that this was to be the last Founders' Day until 1947. A month afterwards, the open-air theatre saw its first play, The Merchant of Venice, produced by Mr. Gibson and very colourfully staged in magnificent Indian dresses borrowed from various sources, but particularly Rampur. The open-air theatre, which had at first been regarded with some suspicion, was coming into its own. During the summer holidays, the ICS probationers who were undergoing training in tents at the FRI moved into Hyderabad and Kashmir houses. This happened annually for the next 3 years. From 1943 to 1945, a selection board occupied Tata House during the holidays. The government had been asked whether master's services could be made use of during the holidays and rather reluctantly allowed the headmaster to work in army headquarters in Shimla for a month. There seemed nothing useful that the others could do, so Holdy and Martin went off to fish the Wangat, Vishansar, Kishanganga and the Kangan. As they left Srinagar, Hitler was claiming the complete destruction of the Russian armies. When they returned, they were rather surprised to find that Mr. Thomas had joined up. He had been accustomed to profess pacifist views, but apparently decided that the evils of Nazism necessitated the use of force. After training at Belgaum, he joined the 3 and 9th Gurkhas. He never rejoined the school because by the end of the war, he had decided to take orders. Another shock, as he had previously been an agnostic. Mr. Roy was back from England in time for the beginning of term, and Mr. Shom took Mr. Thomas's work. Mr. Kapoor moved into Jaipur House. In September, Mr. Moore started to get the school organized in case of air raids. In the course of the next year, the preparations became quite elaborate. Trenches were dug near the boarding houses, and when air raid signals were given, everyone had to take cover. Boys were grouped into first aid parties and fire parties, and when a raid took place, certain people were to be the casualties while the fire parties received news of where the bombs had fallen. Some people had lots of fun extinguishing imaginary fires with real stirrup pumps. One night, Dehradun had to stage a complete blackout and an aeroplane flew overhead. In October 1941 took place the first of several more or less annual celebrations in the honor of Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. This year, both Valmiki Pratibha and Sacrifice were performed in the open-air theatre, with Mr. Chetan Anand playing the main role in the latter. A subsequent issue of the weekly contained an exchange of opinions as to whether it was appropriate for boxing to be held in the same place as Tagore's plays. In November 1941, the first Dehradun Olympics, which later came to be called District Sports, were held at St. Joseph's Academy, with Mr. Muin as secretary and organizer. One evening in December, Mr. Martin was sitting in his bungalow when the headmaster walked in, escorting a familiar figure. It was Pandit Nehru, unexpectedly released from jail an hour or so earlier. They all talked about the mountains of Kashmir. When Reuters in Bombay received a teleprinter report, Nehru called on foot Doon School. They felt there must be some mistake because Pandit Nehru could not have walked to the Doon School. The term closed under the shadow of the cloud cast by the news of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. While there was a considerable churning in the geopolitical scenario in India and across the globe, and more drastic times were to follow, the school continued establishing value-based traditions responsible for its robust ethos, which is admired till date.
The content of this podcast comprises history, anecdotes, and memories regarding the Doon School. The IPSS expressly disclaims any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use this podcast or the information presented in this podcast.